Iraq, and France. But why are some of them good and others violent? What makes a protester courageous? What makes a protester bad? Which ones are rioters? And which ones are fighting the good fight? If you're watching mainstream media, sometimes things can get confusing. Protests are described as a violent mob in one country and a pro-democracy revolution in another. And some protests don't get any coverage at all. Who decides which protests are worthy of which labels? And why? First and most importantly, it's all about location, location, location. To all you protesters, rioters, and violent mobs out there, if you want that coveted peaceful protester label that garners nonstop headlines and Western adoration, it's crucial that you protest from a country or territory that's on the US State Department's hit list. Protest against the government in Venezuela, Iran, Nicaragua, or Hong Kong, and you're guaranteed to get the hero treatment in US media, and probably even some lavish funding from USAID. It literally doesn't matter why you're protesting. It could be for better living conditions or for a violent right-wing ideology, which in these places it usually is. You're pretty much guaranteed to be portrayed in a positive light no matter what you do, no matter how much violence you inflict. That's why the right-wing mobs that overthrew Bolivia's democratically elected socialist president, Evo Morales, were simply referred to as protesters, no matter how violent and racist their behavior was. So for 2 weeks, these violent right-wing mobs rioted for the downfall of Morales after refusing to accept the results of his re-election. They broke into Bolivian radio offices, forced out the workers, and tied one of them to a tree, and were still called protesters. Even after they kidnapped and publicly tortured a Bolivian town socialist mayor, forcibly cut her hair, doused her in red paint, and paraded her through the streets barefoot, the BBC referred to them as a crowd of protesters. The New York Times also saw these kidnappers as merely protester. Right-wing mobs in Venezuela that have literally lynched people get the same royal treatment in Western media, in lockstep with the US government's operation to overthrow Maduro. The same goes for protests in Hong Kong, where the US is funding a violent anti-China separatist movement that regularly beats up those who disagree with them, often flagrantly on film. They recently lit a man on fire. And how does the media describe these people?
Pro-democracy and anti-government activists. Peaceful demonstration inside. It was a peaceful protest of pro-democracy activists.
These so-called pro-democracy activists haven't said much about democracy. They're just anti-China. Hence, they're good, lovable protesters. Speaking of which, for those of you protesting governments that are friends with the US, you're shit out of luck. You're not protesters, you're violent mobs of rioters. Or your protests are treated like they don't exist. But Palestinians, forget about it. You can't even carry a rock, or you're a terrorist. And definitely don't approach any fences, or you'll get shot and the international media will lose interest even as the body count rises into the hundreds. You see, protests are worthy or unworthy based solely on how they impact US geostrategic interests. So protest accordingly. Good luck.